What about West Papua? Now, we all know about the Ukraine, a little bit about Myanmar, lots about Syria, almost nothing about Yemen. But what about West Papua? Now, we see the Australian government giving support to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. And we see the Australian government take a minimal negative stance against the Myanmar government. But for some reason, in the Australian imagination, at a government level, social media level, legacy media level, and at people's level, nobody's talking about West Papua. The atrocities that have occurred in West Papua over the last 60 years make what's happening in the Ukraine pale into insignificance. And to a significant degree, they make the carnage in the Myanmar not look as difficult as the situation in West Papua. I'll give you a few facts. Now, the first thing is most Australians, and obviously people around the world, don't even know where West Papua is. West Papua is 67 kilometres from the Australian coast. 67 kilometres. That's less than the width of Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane. 67 kilometres. It is half of the island which makes up Papua New Guinea and West Papua. It is an artificially constructed entity. The colonial history of that particular island involves German occupation, it involves British occupation, it involves Dutch occupation, Japanese occupation, and currently Indonesian occupation. The Germans and British colonised Papua New Guinea. The Dutch colonised West Papua, and the Japanese during World War II took over large segments of West Papua, used them as a military basis. And then 60 years ago, through the so-called Act of Determination, which was supported by the Australian government, West Papua was handed lock, stock and barrel to the Indonesian government. West Papua has become an integral component of the Indonesian economy because of the extraordinary wealth which is incorporated within that part of what is described as the largest island in the world. Australia is a continent. Gold, copper, bauxite, titanium, extraordinarily rich forests. It's mountainous and girt by sea. Now, the original inhabitants of West Papua are Melanesian. They're the same people that inhabit Papua New Guinea and parts of the Pacific, like Fiji and the Solomon Islands. So there's a Melanesian background, similar to people from the Torres Strait, which is part of Australia. So what occurred? Well, for almost 400 years, the Dutch exploited West Papua. And after World War II, when the Japanese occupation of Indonesia was overturned, the Indonesian people, after 500 years of exploitation through colonisation, began a liberation movement. And that liberation movement saw the Dutch government give up its Indonesian colonies except for West Papua. It wasn't until 1967 that West Papua was integrated into Indonesia. So what did West Papuans have in common with Indonesians? Nothing. They're not the same people. They don't have the same culture. They don't have the same languages. But Indonesia was very keen to get its hands on West Papua because it required the extraordinary resources. The biggest deposit of gold in the world, they call it a gold mountain, is at Freeport in West Papua. It has extraordinarily rich mineral deposits across the country, extraordinary natural resources. A forest, or a jungle I should say, that rivals the Amazon in terms of its job in sequestering carbon dioxide. Today, the West Papuan people are still involved in a battle, struggle, an armed struggle and a political struggle against Indonesian occupation. Today, 60 years after Indonesian occupation began, we still have guerrilla bands in the highlands involved in an armed struggle against the Indonesian government. The people of West Papua are now slowly becoming a minority in their own land. A similar situation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders on this continent, becoming in a minority. Currently, there's about 1.2 million West Papuans living in West Papua, and an almost equal number of Indonesians who've been brought across in transmigration programs by the Indonesian government, where land which has been stolen from West Papuans is given to Indonesian migrants. So we now have the situation in 2022 that West Papuans are slowly becoming a minority in their own land. At the same time, West Papua has become basically a military dictatorship. Well, it is a military dictatorship of the so-called democratic Indonesian government. The Indonesian military has total control over West Papua because of its rich natural resources. And currently, as well as the exploitation of mineral resources and the extraordinary damage which is occurring to the landscape because of this exploitation, we also have an unremitting campaign to deforest West Papua. Those magnificent jungles which stood there for millions of years, which sequestered carbon dioxide, are being cut down rapidly. The country is slowly becoming deforested. And at the same time, the West Papuan population is being rapidly pushed out of their traditional lands. But it's worse than this. As I said before, West Papua is nothing more than an Indonesian military garrison. There are 220,000 armed Indonesian troops stationed in West Papua. That is one Indonesian soldier for every single male West Papuan. Think about it. If you live in Australia, there'd be about, maybe say 8 million adult males in this country. It's equivalent to having 8 million Russian troops or 8 million Russian or Chinese troops in Australia, or Indonesian troops. As I said before, think of it, 67 kilometres from the Australian coastline, 220,000 Indonesian troops, one soldier for every adult West Papuan male. Since the so-called Act of Integration in 1967, over 500,000 West Papuans have died directly and indirectly as a result of the Indonesian occupation. That's 500,000. Every family in West Papua is touched by this disaster. Today we see people disappearing, their bodies found or never found. We see the West Papuan standard of living is grossly below Indonesian standard of living. We see them continuously being removed from their lands. And the latest insult to injury, apart from the armed occupation, is the removal of the forests, the removal of the sago palm, which is fundamental to the survival of West Papuans, who are mainly a subsistence agricultural people, being replaced by the ubiquitous oil palm. Extraordinary situation. So, what have successive Australian governments done regarding the situation? Well, they have actively assisted the Indonesian military government, first under Suharto the Butcher, first of all Sukarno the nationalist, then Suharto the military dictatorship, the Butcher, and now under so-called parliamentary elections, we have seen the Australian government actively support the genocide through providing arms to the Indonesian government, which are used in West Papua, to providing training in Australia for Indonesian troops in counter-insurgency training, who go back to West Papua and put that training into place, slaughtering the indigenous people at will. But the West Papuan resistance continues, despite draconian laws like a mandatory 10-year sentence if you display the West Papuan flag. Draconian laws which have seen families torn apart, which have seen West Papuans flung to all corners of the earth as refugees. And we have more than our fair share of refugees in this country from West Papua, who, unlike most asylum seekers and refugees, continue that struggle for West Papuan independence. My late wife and myself first came across the West Papuans in 1994. West Papuan refugees here in Melbourne. And the extraordinary thing about the West Papuan independence struggle, it is supported by no one. It is not supported by the United Nations, because it was a sham United Nations act of integration which allowed the Indonesians to take it over. They're not supported by the United States or Russia or China or anybody else. They're actively isolated, marginalised, criminalised by successive Australian governments, who even refuse to use the word West Papuan in the Houses of Parliament. I'll give you an example. About 6 years ago, a West Papuan Australian activist living in Darwin died in a bicycle accident. A DLP senator at that time, and then the same senator became independent, wished to place a condolence motion for this woman. Both the opposition, which was the Labor Party at that stage, and the Liberal National Party, refused to support the condolence motion or even being heard in Parliament unless the word West Papua was removed from that motion. So the West Papuan people have to rely on people like you and me. That's right. They don't rely on the Trumps of the world. Bidens of the world, the Albaneses of the world, the Morrisons of the world. They don't rely on the rich and famous. They don't rely on celebrities. They rely on people like us. And 8 years ago we made a momentous decision. And that decision was to set up a collective to pay the rent for an office for the West Papuan independence struggle in this country. An office which today, 8 years later, continues to be paid for by people like you and me. And the whole purpose of the West Papuan Rent Collective is to raise the necessary funds to keep the office opening, not in some back alley, but in the Docklands, on Collins Street, one of the most prestigious so-called suburbs of Melbourne. Because we wanted this office to be a de facto embassy for the West Papuan independence struggle. And over the last 8 years it's become instrumental in coordinating that struggle, especially the struggle to have the question of the decolonisation of West Papua from Indonesian colonisation put forward in the United Nations, and for the United Nations to look at the issue of West Papuan independence. Now the purpose of the Rent Collective is very simple. We pay the rent. People like you and me, not the rich and famous, not the Murdochs of the world, not the Stokes of the world, not the Twiggies of the world, but people like you and me. People on disability support pensions, old age pensions, minimal incomes are the people that make the backbone of the West Papuan Rent Collective. And this has given the West Papuan activists in Australia and around the world a platform by which to pursue their struggle. It's not our job to tell the West Papuan people how to conduct their struggle. That's their job. It's not our job to pay for the ongoing costs of the office, but it is our job to provide that stability to pay the rent. And this extraordinary rent collective has now been functioning for over 8 years. And for 8 years the rent has consistently been paid. And for 8 years West Papuans, both in West Papua itself and the rest of the world, have been able to utilise this office to conduct their struggle in a real and a virtual manner. Now, like all organisations, people come and go, people die, people become destitute, no longer able to commit to the West Papuan Rent Collective. So 3 times a year we have a gathering at the office at 838 Collins Street to give people an opportunity to look at what the West Papuans do, to give people an opportunity to look at the breadth of their struggle and the direction of that particular struggle, to hear from the West Papuans themselves and to hear from their supporters. And we hold these gatherings to encourage people to join the Rent Collective. And currently we are asking people to donate $1 a day to the Rent Collective. And it's very simple. If you go to the West Papuan website or you go to my Facebook page, you'll be able to see how you can donate to the Rent Collective. It's very simple. You can do it virtually. It's a simple process. It's $1 a day, $30 a month, 365 days a year. Currently we need 20 new members to keep the Rent Collective functioning. We normally need about 80 to 85 active members who are able to contribute to the Rent Collective. On Sunday the 11th of September we'll be holding a gathering of the West Papuan Rent Collective and supporters and interested people to listen to speakers, to listen to people who are interested in West Papua, to listen to people who've been to West Papua, to listen to the refugees from West Papua regarding the extent and the importance of that struggle. Now, I know currently there are many financial pressures on people, especially with increasing inflation, stagnant wages. But the fact is, $1 a day isn't as much as you think. It's 2 cups of coffee in a restaurant or a cafe every week. It's possibly 2 pizzas a week, 2 bottles of horrible wine, 6 bottles of beer. So you can actually improve your situation as far as your health is concerned, and also contribute. At the same time, during the gathering, there'll be a lunch at 1 p.m. on Sunday the 1st of December. So on Sunday the 11th of September, that's right, Sunday the 11th of September, will be a lunch at 1 p.m. to which you are all invited. Please feel free to donate for this West Papuan lunch. Then there'll be guest speakers, including Dr. Jacob Barumbiak. Third, the West Papuan activist who spent over 10 years in jail, shot by the Indonesian government, escaped to Australia. He'll be talking about the length and breadth of the struggle as he's a senior member of the transitional government for West Papua. So you're all welcome. 838 Collins Street, Docklands. Walk around to the back, there's a barbecue area, there's a large meeting room, meet people, have an interesting afternoon, 1 p.m. There'll also be an auction of 2 pieces of recycled furniture, furniture made from recycled timber to raise money. This is furniture which is made by David Mackenzie. There'll also be other items to be auctioned from Margaret the Maker. Every cent goes to the West Papuan Rent Collective. But most importantly of all, we need you to join the Rent Collective. Come along on Sunday, the 11th of September, 838 Collins Street, Docklands. You can catch a tram right to the front door, walk around the back, there's a barbecue area, meeting room, all part of the network that the West Papuans are able to use. I encourage you, if there's one thing you are going to do this year that's important, it is to join the West Papuan Rent Collective. As I said before, we pay the rent, the West Papuans organise and conduct their independence struggle the way they see fit. See you Sunday, 1 p.m, 838 Collins Street, Docklands. Walk around the back. Support the West Papuan independence struggle.